Oh, I was just put back in here.
Okay.
It did just happen.
I'll send a note to get you sent back to the booth, Maggie.
Okay, thank you.
No problem.
Okay, so I see a couple of people who are joining us. We're just going to wait for a few minutes. So I see, am I pronouncing it right? DeVry, are you there? Hello. Hi, Dieudonné. Hello. So we're just waiting a couple of minutes to let people come in. So please be patient as everyone negotiates the technology. And okay, well, I'm going to get started. My name is Richard Nimogene, and I'm a professor in the School of Indigenous and Canadian Studies at Carleton University. And I've been teaching at Carleton since 1999. And I came to Carleton in 1989 for doctoral studies. So I've been at Carleton for a very long time, and I think it's a great place to study when I studied here, and it's a great place to work, to teach. And so in Canadian Studies, we are an interdisciplinary unit, which means that we have people in all sorts of disciplines and backgrounds. We have historians, architects. My background is political science and national identity. There are people who do music, art, gender studies. And the thing to remember about Canadian studies is that you're always trying to explain Canada and how Canada connects to the world. And so I've started off the slide with this idea of why study Canada and why Canadian studies. And the reason for that is that as you leave high school and start university, students often have it that they got to think about, okay, I'm picking a new major, I'm picking a discipline, sociology, psychology, and they start to think, okay, this is different than high school. And I'm coming here and saying, well, Canadian studies is interdisciplinary. We have different people. But For those of you who certainly are in Ontario high schools, it's important to remember that you are studying Canada and the world as part of your high school studies from grade 9 to grade 12. And so in the Canadian Studies program, you are still going to be doing that. You're going to be continuing that. So while it may look different than other disciplines, you're always thinking about explaining Canada. So what I want to do in this time that we have together is talk a little bit about how we study Canada, why we study Canada. I'll tell you a little bit about the program and why it might be interesting for you. And then I'd like to really, if you have questions, try to give you some answers. So, why Canadian studies? And so to build on what I said, Canadian studies, it's different than other disciplines because we are studying ourselves. We are studying the country we live in. If you're an international student, you're studying the country that you are moving to. And it's when I call it an activist and problem-oriented discipline, what I mean by that is that the knowledge we gain about Canada changes Canada. So it's not like about learning the laws of physics or something. The knowledge we learn from each other and from thinking about Canada from different perspectives ultimately leads to changing Canada. And so, as I say, in Canadian Studies, we do it from a variety of perspectives. As Tom Simons, who is like the Dean of Canadian Studies, who had in 1975, there was a big national inquiry into why don't we know more about Canada. He reminds us that Canadian Studies, it's not about celebrating Canada. It's not about, cheerleading. It's not about flag waving. Although that might be a phenomenon that we try to understand. Instead, he says, it's about critical engagement. How do we explain Canada? That's what our goal is. Critical analysis, not critical in terms of being negative, but really trying to come up with solid explanations for why things are happening in the world. So, for instance, just today or last night, it was announced, there was an important announcement by the government about the flag. And as you know, the flag has been at half-mast for a few months now because of the discoveries that we saw at former residential schools. And then there was a movement, well, Canada is a proud country, Remembrance Day is coming up, we need to raise the flag. In Canada, we're trying to understand how different people negotiate Canada. So this is what I mean by critical engagement. We're trying to explain things. Here's a little screenshot of an article I wrote about Justin Trudeau. And it's trying to explain why is he really popular outside of Canada, but less so inside. This is what we try to do. We try to explain Canada. So, because the other thing that's important to remember is that Canada changes. Regardless of our age, we tend to think of Canada for the moment in time that we really come of age. And so, I had a student once ask me a question. I was giving a lecture about equality rights and the Charter of Rights. And a student asked me very sincerely, why do we need to talk about marriage equality and gender equality? This is Canada. We have the Charter of Rights. We have We have freedoms. It's a democratic country. And I said, well, we do have that, but we still don't have full equality. But it's also, we need to remember where we came from, right? So the idea of Canada today, you know, if you talk to your parents or your grandparents and their experiences of Canada, they would tell you very, very different stories about things. So here's the idea that one of the things we want to do is to explain how and why Canada changes. The historian H.V. Nells, if you're interested in Canadian history, I really recommend that you try to find this book. It really is a little history of Canada. It's maybe 100 pages long, but he makes the really important point for thinking about Canada. Canada's story is one of change. It's changed a lot in the past, and it's going to keep changing in the future. Okay, I gave the example of the flag and, you know, half-mast. We are in a new period of change in Canada for all sorts of reasons. Not only change driven within Canada, but also outside. The pandemic, climate change, racism and discrimination, migration, refugees. All of these things contribute to a changing Canada. So we need to have a lens for explaining Canada. This is something that I show my students when I teach first-year Canadian studies. And if you are a young Canadian, you might think of Canada as a country that celebrates multiculturalism, diversity, it has bilingualism. We do not have far-right extreme politics that, you know, France has and other countries have. Yet that doesn't mean that Canada does not have a history of racism or that racism has disappeared. And this is in the early days of polling, where we see, you know, Canada until the early 1970s, in fact, had a racialized immigration policy. And so these polls ask, essentially, who would you like to keep out? Which is important for young Canadians to know, because today, you know, we have a consensus on immigration. We want more immigration. Even with the pandemic, the government is increasing targets for immigration, right? But our history, you know, if you say, politicians say things like, Canada's a country of immigrants, well, in fact, we have a very different history. And in the same way, when we think about race in Canada, often we say the United States has racism, Canada doesn't. But in fact, there's a history of this. And Canada has struggled to overcome this, right? Canada had slavery into the 1800s. Canada wasn't just the destination on the Underground Railroad. And the question is, how does Canada go from this to Canada being a country of diversity and immigration? So those are the kinds of questions we ask. How do we explain this? Here's another way that I use to explain the idea of change. And I use the early 1960s. I was born in the early 1960s. So in my lifetime, Canada has changed dramatically, right? Think about all the things that we take for granted as Canadians today that we didn't have. We didn't have bilingualism. We didn't have multiculturalism. The early days of multiculturalism, many Canadians rejected it. We didn't have an open immigration policy. We didn't have a flag. We didn't have a constitution with a Charter of Rights. All of these things that define modern Canada have come about in my lifetime. And so if you're there as a young Canadian, you think, wow, what would happen in 50 years' time, to change, right? So that's why I think Canadian studies is important. The other reason is, when I talked about change and I talked about Canadian studies as activist and problem-oriented, is that Canadian studies emerges because the country itself was in crisis. You might have heard of the FLQ crisis in Quebec in the 1960s, culminating with the kidnapping and killing of a politician in Quebec, the country and the rise of a separatist movement in Quebec. We needed the tools to be able to understand Quebec from English Canada. And so how do we deal with this? And people were discovering that we didn't really have a way to explain it. So as Hodgetts, the historian, said, we have this very English, British explanation of Canada that doesn't really explain what's going on in the country. And so there was there was a study. I mentioned Simons in 1975. Look at the title of his report, To Know Ourselves. Why do we need to study Canada, right? We need to understand what's going on in our country. And what they discovered, in fact, in the 1960s in English Canada was that most of the professors and the books that were used were either British or American, and using those perspectives to explain Canada. In Quebec, often this was coming from France. And so we didn't really have a good understanding of what was going on in the country to explain this dramatic change and the national unity crisis. As he said, Canada provides a different way of living, right? And we need to know it. That's why we study Canada. I'm currently in Europe, and so in the virtual world, I can be in Europe and speak to you. Let me tell you that many Europeans often do not see a big difference between Canada and the United States. They know there's some difference. Okay, Trump and Trudeau, they're different, but they think they're kind of similar countries. And Simons was trying to say, well, in fact, there's a different way for thinking about Canada, that Canadians have their own way. And in fact, in studies, I teach a class on Canada and the United States, and we try to talk about how are the countries similar, how are they different, how do they work together? And this is also a challenge that the government faces. So what we're learning is very much of interest. And that's why I think Canadian studies is attractive for students. So here again, we see, I talked about old crises and old challenges. Well, we continue to face them. And how do we, before the pandemic, the big issue was climate change, or as the slide shows, the climate emergency. Well, Canada was also founded very much on the extraction of resources. And so at the one level, we are trying to be leaders in the world in the fight on climate change, but we're also on a per capita basis, one of the biggest polluters in the world. And we saw the Prime Minister, the government buying a pipeline. We are currently engaged in a fight with the United States about keeping an old polluting pipeline open that goes to Michigan. How do we explain this seeming contradiction? This, of course, is very much connected to nation-to-nation relations with First Nations and Indigenous peoples. And we heard the new Indigenous the minister responsible for relations with Indigenous peoples come out and say after he was appointed, this is about land. And we had the Oka crisis in the late 1980s, where land was occupied, preventing Canadian society from accessing, and there was a standoff with the military. Or the little cartoon that might not be clear, it's a politician, Preston Manning, who was leader of a party called the Reform Party, who wanted essentially anyone caught illegally entering or refugees to be sent away. And we have an elder, an Indigenous elder, with a genealogy book saying, that's Irish. How, you know, in other words, how did you get to this land? How do you get to decide who stays and who goes, right? So we have our history continues to inform current issues in Canada. And then, of course, you know, we had the big tragic event in London, Ontario, the question of racism, of Islamophobia. We have anti-Semitism, and we have a variety of challenges to the positive model that we've built. And it's not black or white or super clear. We keep on thinking about these things. And that's what we do in Canadian studies, right? We try to understand. So, you know, racial and ethnic minorities, you know, would say to my student that I mentioned, well, yeah, we have equality, but we don't have real equality yet. We see this during the pandemic, where we know that racial and ethnic minorities, women, Indigenous peoples, have suffered more economically and health-wise in the pandemic than other people, right? So it's not enough to say, well, we have multiculturalism or we believe in diversity or so forth. So Canada, I would tell my students, is driven by the ongoing struggle for inclusion. How do we live up to the values that we believe in? And so in Canadian studies, you become part of this discussion. And the knowledge that you take from this and help create, you take into Canada. You go on and work and so forth. So here, the sum up, we get away from thinking about Canada or Canadians as having certain characteristics. Right? We try to understand change in Canada and the ongoing fight for inclusion, right? And we do critical analysis, not negative analysis, but we are academics. We are trying to build knowledge of Canada. And so, in the School of Canadian Studies, as a student in the program, you will have this opportunity to think about Canada through these different lenses. Thinking about Canada, you can do Canadian studies, you can do Indigenous studies. Our department was initially called the Institute of Canadian Studies, and in 1957, we actually gave Carleton's first graduate program, the first MA, and it was the first MA in Canadian Studies in the country. And then we became the School of Canadian Studies in 1992. And then a couple of years ago, we also changed as Canada changed, and we changed our name to the School of Indigenous and Canadian Studies, because we were recognizing that to call ourselves the School of Canadian Studies at a time of reconciliation was not the right name. And so our curriculum has changed, and what we include in our courses has changed. And in fact, you could do a combined honors in Indigenous studies. And remember, I said you can look at Canada from any number of ways. And if you go to carleton.ca faculty.ca/SICS, that's our main website. You go to the faculty website and you'll see that what me and my colleagues talk about, right? You might be interested in global issues, Canada, US, politics, national identity. Then I'm sort of someone that you would be interested in taking classes with. But you might be interested, we have a real strength in heritage conservation and architecture. And some of my colleagues are connected to the architecture department. As I mentioned, you can do, we are doing much more in terms of critical race and critical multiculturalism, gender studies. A lot of the other departments in the university came out of Canadian studies. So gender studies came out of Canadian studies. Indigenous studies is a big thing. Public history and memory, or Quebec. If you go to the faculty profile, you'll see that people do all sorts of things, and it's fun because when I have students, like I'm teaching this year, I'm teaching this term a first-year course. Next year, I'm teaching a third-year course. But I have someone who was in some of my colleagues' courses, and they read some of my work, and they said, but, it was interesting. In Professor Mackey's course, we have new ways of understanding this. So we can combine different things. And what's great for you as a student is that you find what interests you. I mentioned debates and change in Canadian study. These are examples of the courses that we offer. You want to think about some of these big questions of Canada. So in the first year, you would only normally take one class in Canadian studies. You don't want to do, and that's true of any department. If you're in history, you don't want to take 3 history in your first year because students change a lot, change their major a lot. But in first year, we have what's called a first year seminar, which is a small class of 30 students where you work on your skills and explain Canada and you get to know colleagues. We have classes on debating Canada, on debates about language and power, and so forth. You go through and you'll see in these courses, these are our only courses, there's always a strong element of Indigenous studies, even in the non-Indigenous studies courses. And so what you can do, there are different program options, and I'm just going to mention them to you, and you can always talk about this with me or with the advising people, the recruiting people, and admissions. But in Canadian studies, you can do an honors program, or you can do what's called combined honors, which is you do 2 majors. So it could be a related department like history, or it could be Indigenous studies, and there are rules about that. Another nice thing is that in our Canadian Studies program, and you can learn more about it by looking at our website, we have something called applied electives. So in the old days, the English department in the 1960s in most Canadian universities didn't have courses on Canadian literature, if you can imagine. There were often not courses on Canadian politics or Canadian, but now, of course, all the departments have courses on Canada. And what we say is, if you take this course on, I don't know, Quebec history, we will count that towards your Canadian Studies degree. So you get to explore the other part. We also have a few specialized minors, and there are 2 that I want to draw your attention to. We have a new minor in Quebec Studies, which is really trying to focus on Quebec and language And you would, in a minor, you have to do a few courses on this. The other one that's very interesting is heritage and conservation, and that's something that we're quite well known for internationally. And so you can do a major and a minor as well. The last thing I would mention is that Carleton does have something called the Mention Français, which is something, a notation if you are a native French speaker or consider yourself quite fluently bilingual, you can do courses that count towards that designation. And even like if you take my courses, I tell students all the time, you can write your work in French. So the other thing, of course, when I speak to students and parents, you know, I studied political science. I had to tell my father, he wanted me to go into business, and he was like, what are you going to do with a political science degree? And, you know, and I said, I don't know, but I like it and I'm getting A's. And you know, when I was doing business, I didn't enjoy it. I didn't like it. And when you don't like something, you don't do well. And so what we find is that our students, because they're interested in their world, tend to do well. And as you see here, what you hear, you won't get a job, right? Well, you know, well, if you're good, if you're smart, you have good critical analysis skills that you will develop, you have interdisciplinary speaking, you have knowledge of indigenous studies, right? Think about it in the current moment. Government and businesses want people who have an understanding of the big issues with nation-to-nation relations. And so we have people working all over the city, all over the country, all over the world. And why is that? Because the combination of working on critical thinking, of being able to always explain Canada, you're not just learning about Canada, but you're explaining it and contributing to our understanding. You get really strong analytical skills that will really, really help you. And, you know, you can go to our website and talk about our alumni and read about some of their stories. But, you know, often I teach a first-year course, and a lot of students in the first-year courses are in other programs, and they take this course and they go, wow, this is really interesting, and this is my world, and they've come on. And so Cara de Grange here is a former student of mine who in first year switched into Canadian Studies and went on to do a PhD. One of our part-time instructors, Brittany Bose, you'll see her on the website, was the same thing. She took my first year class many years ago, and now she's teaching, right? So you get that ability to do things. Another thing that's important is that we have something called a practicum. Students often talk about co-op and paid work. We do something different where we have a course for credit where we try to get you working on a part-time basis, 10 hours a week, to do work related to your interests. And it's a way to network. You don't get paid, but you get academic credit, and hopefully you do work that will help you post-degree. So we have a lot of interesting alumni from the BA and MA program. We had a guitarist, professional rock guitarist, which was interesting. We have filmmakers, we have writers, plus, you know, people who work in the public service and so forth. But to me, the success of our graduates comes out of the fact that they are studying what is of interest. And when you're motivated to learn more about your world, you do better, right? That's the basic story. And the other thing that they like, we're a small program. So I know you can't, it's hard to visit the campus right now because of the pandemic, but we have our floor on Dunton Tower, you know, the big tall office building on campus. We have a student lounge, so students will sit there. They get to know the professors, right? Because they're, you know, we're like a dozen or 15 faculty members. So we're around and you really get to know us. And I think that's something that, knock on wood, post-pandemic, you will be able to enjoy again. And I think the other thing that's important from a student perspective is when you go out into the world, even if it's to go on to a graduate degree, the professors who taught you can write references for you because they really do know you, right? As opposed to a huge department. So that's, I think, something that's beneficial. So I'm going to stop it there, and I'm going to give a heads up to Molly, who's working with us, that what I would like is that if you have any questions, that you can put them into the Q&A. I don't know that we have audio for it, but there's a chat, and you can send questions, and I can try to answer them. And the other thing that I would say is we have a student, Maggie, who is a senior undergraduate student, in the virtual booth for Canadian Studies. You know, we have these virtual drop-ins. Molly is there right now, or after this presentation, you can go and talk to her and see from a student perspective how the program looks. I'll also say that from 11 a.m. to 2 p.m. I will be at the booth. So if you want to come back and ask me questions, we can talk about it. Otherwise, what I would encourage you to do is my email is right here, and drop me a line and we can find a time to set up a Zoom meeting. So I'm going to stop it there. And if you have questions, please let me know. So thank you for your attention. And let me say there are no dumb questions. Okay, there's an answer. There's a question about finance, and I'm not the right person to ask about that. That's the kind of question you need to ask the admissions and recruiting people. So this is your time, so please, you know. Thank you. Molly just posted a link in the chat, and that was for Dieudonné, who asked the question. There's a link there to find out about the financial aspects. And I would say, as someone who's worked at the university for a long time, Carleton is well known for having a very responsive and informative admissions team, and they can answer any questions that you have. I know there are all sorts of attractive scholarships for new students, and And that's also something you should ask about. Are there other questions? I see there's Rogane and Dieudonné. Maybe if you have a question, this is the chance. Otherwise, Molly will go ahead and close the session. So, as I said, thanks very much. I don't see any questions. So if you do have something comes to your mind, you can find out more. I encourage you to visit our website. You can visit my website, richardnimagine.ca as well. So thanks very much for your attention, and I hope it was informative for you. So thanks very much. And Molly, we can go ahead and close it now.